Do you feel like you're the best version of yourself? This does not mean perfection. We know there's no such thing as that. But in general, do you feel like you're showing up as the person you want to be in the world? This week, I'm talking with Evan Kuterbach, who left his full-time corporate career to co-found Canyon Pickleball. Here we talk about a wide range of topics, including how to build connections when you're in a new place, how to manage self-doubt when you're navigating change, and why it's so important to be the best version of yourself. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Evan. It's so exciting to have this conversation with you today, and I'd love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Kim, thanks so much for having me. So yeah, my name's Evan. I am currently living in Orlando, Florida. I'm from Dallas, Texas, and I moved here from Colorado. So I'm kind of a little bit of a transplant all over. But yeah, I'm super excited to be here. So I am the co-founder of a brand called Canyon Pickleball. I'm also a solopreneur. So I left the kind of corporate 9 to 5 grind about a year and a half ago, which we'll kind of dig into a little bit. But yeah, it's just been an absolute whirlwind. And so, yeah, I'm just excited to talk about things that I've kind of gathered over the last really 12 years of working professionally. So,
Well, and I'm excited to hear more about that transition too, having made a similar transition many years ago from corporate to solopreneur. I know that there is a lot of excitement, but also, intimidation that goes with that. And
totally.
and you certainly picked an area that's very popular right now too with pickleball. I have to confess that I haven't tried it yet myself, but I know it's everywhere. Everyone's talking about it, so it seems like you timed the market well.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, we definitely got to get you out there at some point.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what you were doing before you started this?
Sure. Yeah. So for a little over 10 years, I was working in primarily like client-facing sales roles, a lot of marketing roles, was working at some pretty big companies. I worked at Oracle for about 3.5 years. I worked at Canon, like the camera company, for about 3.5 years. And then towards kind of the end of my kind of corporate career, I was more in like the startup space. So I worked with like a lot of software startups, again, kind of in like client-facing sales roles, marketing roles. And so started gravitating more towards kind of the startup space towards the end of my career. But yeah, so it was like, yeah, about 11 years or so, but that kind of led me to a lot of different locations. Like I mentioned, like I went to college in Oklahoma, moved to Phoenix out of college, then moved to Houston, then to Colorado. And so I've bounced a lot, right? I've been in a lot of different areas. So
That's amazing. And that probably too comes with its own level of excitement, but also, it's not easy to transition to all of these different places and build a whole new community for yourself.
yeah. It's honestly like I always joke about it being, almost like kind of commonplace because I've done it so much now. Like I've gotten so used to just like kind of uprooting my life and making new friends. And it's funny because now, because I have not only, been with a lot of different companies and a lot of locations, but I've got a lot of friend groups in a lot of different places now, which is pretty cool. But there is a lot of loneliness that comes from that because, I had lived a little bit of a nomadic lifestyle until I met my wife, really. And then we've had, a daughter now at this point. But yeah, there was a lot of scared times, and still kind of is.
Yeah. Well, and I grew up moving because my dad worked for the car industry and got transferred a lot.
Mm,
I kind of think of myself as a born networker because I had no choice. Right. But
yeah.
it wasn't, it wasn't always pleasant, but you do learn some really great adaptability skills and networking skills when you're moving all the time.
Totally, yeah. And I think it's something that I didn't even realize was kind of like prepping me for like this entrepreneurial solopreneurship journey was all the networking because again, it was almost kind of out of habit. Like I had to do it. There was no other choice but to like either sit in your home and be by yourself or go out and start building connections with people and strike up conversations at a random coffee shop and try to just make your way. So
No, you're absolutely right. And I wonder if you have any advice for people who maybe are in transition right now or thinking about it for, any kind of practical tips that you can give to people around getting started with networking or building those kinds of connections.
yeah, it's one of those things that I say it's kind of a blessing and a curse. Like my wife knows more about this now, like knowing me for 8 years. But people have always just been like, "Oh, Evan's an outgoing person. Evan's very easy to make friends with people." But at the same time, like that has come with like a lot of practice and a lot of time, just like learning, not just like the skills of networking, but the skills of like people management and people relationship. And so, what I always tell people is I'm 33 now and it's taken me a little while to get here, but it's just like really trying to be true to yourself and just trying to be yourself because I think I spent a lot of time in my early years in not just the corporate life, but in my personal life, like really trying to form not just who I was, but like who I wanted to be centered around and like who was really lifting me up in my life. And so from a networking side, I think when you are just authentically you, when you're vulnerable and you are yourself, you attract that type of people as well, right? Like the universe kind of figures out a way to bring more of those people into your life. So I think the biggest piece of advice I can always say is just learn more about being vulnerable and learn more about just who you are as a person because that authenticity really comes out.
I think that's such a great point because, especially when we talk about confidence, if you feel like you're playing a role when you're trying to connect with people, it feels inauthentic to you, and other people
Totally.
sense that too, right? And
Totally.
it's just so awkward and uncomfortable to do it that way. But to your point too, if you are putting on a persona that's not real for you, then you're not going to be attracting the right people.
Right. Well, because you're also, if you're playing that role, right? If you're playing a role, then you're probably going to attract someone else that's also playing a role. And so then if you're both playing like roles that aren't you, eventually someone's going to crumble and become their actual self. And likely you may not like that actual self, whether it's you or that other person. So I think that, that really is just super important.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I think this might be a good segue into the pickleball conversation too, because I think sometimes too we put pressure on ourselves to network in a more traditionally professional way. But when you talk about vulnerability and you talk about being yourself, I think you can meet a lot of people through your personal interests too that could end up being professional connections. I mean, everybody has a job, everybody does something, but as an avenue into a new community to find something that you're already interested in that, either you want to learn or that you already do well, seems like a great way to get started too, as opposed to trying to go working the room in some awkward professional networking setting, which may or may not work for you, right? I know I'm more extroverted than a lot of other people, but even that
Yeah.
isn't my necessarily cup of tea.
Yeah, yeah, it's so funny too because like I feel like in the first probably like, let's say if I was professionally working in the corporate world for about 11 years, probably like the first 6 or 7 years, like most of my networking it was so much of that like classic, slap on a name tag and like try to like meet people and you're going to all these meetups. And again, if it works for you, great. That's again not really my cup of tea either. I would much rather just like be at Starbucks and then sitting next to random person who's also on a laptop and who looks my age, and then just being like, hey, like, I saw you're working here. I've seen you a couple times now, and then striking up a conversation. But to your point, I think again, it's like knowing yourself, knowing what's interesting to you, and then starting to gravitate towards those types of communities. Because what I've learned, and maybe your listeners who have played pickleball have learned too, but the pickleball community is really similar to some other communities. Like I attribute it to like, the running community, or if you're like in like a CrossFit or something like that's like really like you're just very like-minded individuals, right? Like you're very like-minded. And so when you're there, again, it's very natural. Like I've actually picked up, so background when I left the corporate world is as a freelance marketer. I picked up a marketing client from just playing pickleball. We were just playing on the same court, and he was like, "What do you do for work?" And I was like, "Oh, I do blah blah." And then he was like, "Oh, I actually am looking for a marketer." And so, same kind of thing, right? It's like those networking opportunities happen again because you are going towards things that are just of interest to you. So it doesn't have to be pickleball, but it's just knowing yourself and knowing what you find interesting and starting to get plugged in there.
Yeah, and just feel like you are a, for lack of a better way of saying this, a better version of yourself when you're in your natural habitat, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're just like more authentically like who you would be outside of because and I saw this really funny TikTok that was talking about like basically this persona that we put on right when we're, work mode, right? And it's like, you're like 70 or 80% who you would normally be in the real world when you're in your, co-working space with all your colleagues. And so for people to see you who you authentically are is just like refreshing. And again, you're attracting the same, the people that should be in your life. So yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So tell us more about your interest in pickleball. Is this something that has got deep roots or relatively recently? How did you
Yeah.
get into that?
It's fairly recent. So I actually got into pickleball when I first moved to Florida. So as I kind of mentioned, I'm in Orlando. I moved here from Colorado. My wife was 6 months pregnant when we moved here. Her family is from Florida, so we were like, let's move to Florida. Let's get some help with having a baby, and it's our first kid. And so when we were moving here, like a month before we moved, a buddy of mine told me about pickleball, and to be quite honest, I avoided it because I was like, this feels like, an older person's sport, or it's something that, I played tennis growing up and I was like, this is just gonna, make me a worse tennis player or a worse athlete. And I begrudgingly went out there and played with him. This is like a month before I moved. And then when we moved, we had our daughter. And I was like quickly feeling like very alone, very trapped, and really just trying to like, come to grips with a whole new life I had now, right? We had a new daughter and we were living in a new state where I didn't know many people. And so it felt very lonely, right? It felt very isolating. And so I kind of went back to the idea of, okay, well, I just learned this new sport called pickleball. I had this like free paddle that my buddy gave me. And I know Florida is a big pickleball state. What if I just like go to a court and just, I don't know, just see what it's like. And if it's terrible, then I'm never going to see these people again. And so I showed up and I kind of was learning how to play a little bit with some people. And then I, came home and I told my wife and I was like, yeah, it was pretty fun. It was pretty cool. And I went again the next week and I started and I just kept going and I started to make more connections and I started to just meet more people. And so honestly, at that point, I didn't really think about building a pickleball brand. It was just kind of like this community. It was bringing me out. It was getting my body moving. It made me feel kind of more competitive again. I was playing sports a lot growing up. And so I was just enjoying just playing pickleball. It just kind of, kept becoming this addiction. And then it wasn't until really like January, about this time last year, which is crazy to say that we're in 2025. About this time last year, I met my co-founder through like a marketing community, and we just were talking about business ideas. And I was like, "Have you heard about pickleball? Have you heard about this thing called pickleball?" And he was like, "No, not really." So I explained it to him, and he quickly started understanding a little more about it. And so from there, it just started to build and build and build, and it was kind of a natural occurrence. But yeah, it's kind of about a 2.5 year idea in the making, I guess.
That's amazing. And I love that neither one of you are were like really expert pickleballers who've been doing this for many, many years, right? I think sometimes we have this vision in our minds that in order to start a business or in order to change to a certain type of career, that we have to be experts in it, or that we have to have a
Yeah.
degree in it or whatever, as opposed to just a passion for it.
Yeah, and it's funny too because we are primarily e-commerce, and I tell people all the time, like, they're like, "Oh, did you have a background in e-commerce?" And I was like, "I mean, I've purchased from e-commerce sites, but like, I have no background in e-commerce. Like, I'm a marketer, like, I understand marketing in that sense, but I never dealt with shipping and logistics and like, packaging, like all of those types of conversations that had never happened. So, like you said, right? I mean, I think." And I talk about this a lot on my LinkedIn. This is an area where I tell people, action is always going to beat inaction every step of the way. And that sounds really cliche, but it's true, right? Like just doing the first step. And a lot of times the first step is just Googling. Like we just Googled things. Like we're on YouTube. We're just like, these are the not shiny moments of being an entrepreneur or solopreneur that like people don't talk about, right? Like a lot of times, like I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just Googling things to figure it out. So that's a really intimidating process. And I say that like it's easier said than done, but yeah, that's a big piece of it.
I'm just writing down what you just said. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just Googling it because I think that is so helpful for people to hear. And I appreciate your honesty in saying that because it's funny when I transitioned from corporate to entrepreneurship, I was so, I don't know if relief is the best way to describe it, but I just remember if I felt like the curtain was pulled back and you realize that everyone's just making it up as they go along.
Literally, I posted this on my LinkedIn probably like a month ago, and I was like, "This is my eyes were wide open when I became an entrepreneur." Exact same thing was like you're talking to people, even like CEOs of companies, right? You just grew up thinking that they knew more than you or were experts, but a lot of times they're just figuring it out too. And so the more you're around that, the more it like demystifies this idea of building something. You're just like, no one knows what they're doing. We're all figuring it out. Every single person.
Exactly. And I just think that's so powerful for people to hear because again, we have this view that there's some like magical blueprint out there that we don't have access to. Uh, but
Definitely.
there definitely were probably moments when you questioned yourself or when you did feel a little bit of self-doubt. Like, what did that look like and how did you navigate that?
Yeah. And I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say I still feel self-doubt. I mean, even right now, as we're having this podcast, I'm like thinking about what I'm saying. I'm like having a little bit of imposter syndrome, just like having this conversation right now. Like, even though I can kind of hide that mask, and put on that mask a little more. So I still feel that all the time. But the way that I try to navigate it is knowing that at the end of the day, and I forget who is like, I think a lot of people have talked about this idea, but at the end of the day, most people are not really going to like really remember every interaction in their life, right? And so at the end of the day, like when I am doing a podcast or if I'm like, posting on LinkedIn, like if it flops, if it isn't great, like that's okay. Like I tried something new, I did something different, I tried a different tactic. So like at the end of the day, like the interactions, like most interactions that we have in a day, most things that people see, they're gonna forget. They're not gonna remember what's happening. And you're likely probably, a lot of times not even gonna see some of these people again. So if I'm doing a farmer's market, which I just did yesterday, if I'm on a podcast or whatever, right? Like just putting yourself out there and just trying something. And again, it's easier said than done. It comes with practice. It comes with, more experience of just trying different things. But the more and more I start thinking about that, about the idea that like, so what? Like, if it flops, it flops. If it doesn't do well, it doesn't do well. Like just, you have to just try. So again, I think that just comes from practice.
I totally appreciate that sentiment because that's been a big one for me too, as somebody who's grown up with a lot of anxiety and social pressure and wanting to, put the perfect image out into the world. And I have spent years internalizing the idea that nobody's thinking about you.
Literally.
No, when you wake up at 2 in the morning and you're thinking, I can't believe I said that, or I can't believe I did that. No one else is out there going, I can't believe Evan's podcast was such a flop.
Yeah. Literally. I know. Yeah, well, and it's funny too because like as an like dubbed extrovert, and I say like in quotes for people listening because I always like tell people like people see me as an extrovert, but like internally there's a lot of introvertedness of me. And I think when I grew up with this label, like people told me that I was extroverted, I always felt the need that I needed to be extroverted, or like, oh, because I was in sales, like, oh, Evan's really good at that. So like let me just throw Evan into the mix here because he's good at that. But like sometimes I don't want to be good at that. Sometimes I just want to, be in a ball and not talk to someone. So I think that's a big piece too, is like, when you're labeled a certain thing as you're kind of growing up or you're in your professional career, you're being labeled as this thing, then it feels like that's what you need to conform to every time. But like we all evolve, we all change, we all have different aspects of us, and we're not just one thing. So yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And I think, going back to the earlier points of attracting the right people will follow you through that evolution. And you're not going to keep all the same people in your world from start to finish. It's just not the way we operate. And so
Right.
over the course of that evolution, some people start to fall off. That's not a bad thing either.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I forget who said it. I want to say it was either like Brene Brown or I forget who it was, but they were talking about like again stages of life, right? Like it's like friendships and stages of life and who you are, stages of life. Like you don't have to just again be the same person you were because you were that person when you were 20 or when you were 30 or when you were 40. And same thing with your friends, right? Like we have this idea that like, and it's funny because even to this day, I still do, right? Like, that you have the high school friend who you just assume is probably the same friend they were when they were 17, even though you haven't talked to them in 20 years. They're probably different and hopefully different, right? And it's the same thing, right? So yeah, as stages of life happen, right? Like you have friends for certain stages of life. And I think, at 33 now, I'm still, learning that process too of like friends that you're still holding on to that you think maybe will be coming in this next stage of life, but they're kind of not, and that's hard too to come to grips with. And you're changing yourself, and so yeah, it's all really complicated stuff that honestly just enough people like not enough people talk about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's part of the reason why I do this podcast too. Is like let's get to the messy stuff because
Yeah.
are a professional or an entrepreneur, whatever it is that we're doing in the world, we have this pressure to put on a brave face, to show up as confidently as possible. And what ends up happening is that those of us who are watching other people do this think that it's all smooth sailing, that that's something that they could do, but I could never do, right? Because I'm so aware of my own insecurities and my own perceived flaws. This person has done this perfectly and miraculously. And so to just really create more transparency around the rockiness of our transitions through life, of the choices that we make. And I actually think that is a good segue into a question I wanted to ask you too about just the actual decision to leave a corporate career, which even though there is no guarantee of job security in the corporate world, it feels a little bit more secure, right, than it does being an entrepreneur. Like, how did you find that process? And did you struggle with making that shift?
I struggled a ton, and it was funny because, and I'll get more into it in a second. But there was this period. It was probably like 2 months after I left the corporate world, and like put in my 2 weeks notice and officially left. And I literally had like job applications open for other sales jobs, like on a window on my computer, and I was just like looking at them, and I was just like, maybe I'll just apply and just see if I. And I was like, no, no, stop, stop, stop. And so it was so hard to get into that mindset. But yeah, I struggled with it a ton. Honestly, and this is a funny story, but when my daughter was about to be born, so she was born in November of 21, and I was going on paternity leave, I started just kind of having this like mental shift. And some people have had it again with your moving or if you get married or anything like that. But I started having this mental shift, and I was basically kind of like reevaluating my life. And I was thinking like, do I want to keep going down this path? Right. I've been working kind of a normal 8 to 5, 9 to 5 job for 10 years. It's what my dad did. It's what, all my friends are doing. Do I keep doing that? And so when I was on paternity leave, I basically told my wife, I was like, I kind of think I might want to try something different. And she was like, what do you want to try? And so we were just like chatting through different things. And so while I was on paternity leave, I was like exploring ideas of things. I was thinking about, could I go freelance and do marketing? Could I do freelance sales? Like, are there things I could do? And so I was just exploring things like while on paternity leave, while I'm just like, with my daughter like napping on my chest, and I'm just like on my phone looking at different stuff. And when I came back from paternity leave, I like told my wife, I was like, okay, I'm really going to try to like stay within this job. Like we've got good health benefits, like we've, got good pay. But I really don't know like if I'm going to be able to. And she's like, no, I totally understand. And she's been just absolutely supportive with all of this, which has been huge. And I made it about 3 weeks at my job. I came back from paternity leave, made it about 3 weeks. And then I was like, I can't do it. And I put in my 2 week notice. And so for me, it was really, really hard because being like sales and marketing and specifically sales, like I had a skill set that was needed. So I knew I could get another job. I knew if I wanted to apply, I could get another job. And so to kind of be sitting on this like quote unquote I hate saying the word like golden ticket, but that's kind of what it was. Like I could get another job if I wanted to. And I was really, really fortunate in that aspect. And so it was really hard to like deprogram my brain to say, no, I was not happy when I was in the 8 to 5. I was not a great partner. I hadn't been a dad yet, but now I was like thinking about what am I going to show my daughter for this like, next 10 years of working my 8 to 5. Is that what I want to put forth for her? So honestly, having again the support of my wife and then having my daughter and seeing her every day and being like, I want to be more present for her. I want her to see a different like way to earn an income, a different way to be a present parent. So that was like the driving force. So that kind of kept snapping me out of this idea of like, go back to the corporate world, go back to a job, right? Apply for that job. So honestly, like it's still a struggle, but that was probably the biggest piece that helped me get through it.
I love that because I talk a lot about really connecting with your values, right? And it's easier said than done, but there I really like to think about it through the lens of what will I regret more in the future. And if you because right now we're so in the thick of it and it's hard to remove ourselves from the situation. But if you fast forward 10, 20 years and you ask yourself, like, what will I regret more? Will I regret that I stayed in this, position that was not, was soul crushing? Maybe it's too strong a word, but, or will I regret that I took a risk? And like you said, you had a skill set that you knew you could go back to if you needed to, too. And so, I think at the end of our lives, we tend to regret so much more the risks that we didn't take or those decisions that we didn't make, as opposed to, sort of trying that new thing. And of course,
Yeah. Yeah, and it was like it was that idea too of how can I stop the cycle, right? The cycle of and again for me and my family, this is what we decided, right? Every family is different and if it works for you, it works for you, that's great. But for our family, we've always known, my wife and I had always known that we didn't fit in this like normal 8 to 5 bubble. Like we just didn't fit that. We didn't fit that mold. We tried for years, we just didn't fit that. So we knew and we know that our life is going to be different, right? Like it's going to be a little different in how we make income and how we provide for our family. And so because our parents had done the normal way, like you get into that cycle. And so it was like, okay, like why not us to stop and try something different, right? And to your point, right? Like I literally on my computer right now, I have this sticky note that I've had on my computer since I started my entrepreneurial journey, and it says, "Why not you?"
mm,
And I literally look at that every day. And it's always been this idea of like, why not us? Like, why not us to build something new? Why not us to show that like we can just, pick up our daughter at 1 p.m. because we had the time freedom of not being tied down to like a normal 8 to 5. Why not us to like build this life that we want? So again, this has all come from a lot of legwork and a lot of tough conversations and really, really, really hard months, right? Really, really tough months in this last year and a half. But again, when I look back to what my life was like at the 8 to 5, I was not the best version of myself. I was not someone I was really happy to be. And if I wasn't the best version of myself, why would I want to share that with my daughter? Right? Like I want my daughter to see a great version of myself. So I had to change something.
that's so powerful. And I think we're talking about this at the start of a new year when a lot of people are making decisions around, do I stay? Do I go? What do I want to do when I grow up? Right? All those kinds of bigger questions that we don't usually ask ourselves. And I think that's such an important one is, does the situation that I'm in or the path that I'm on allow me to be the best version of myself? And you're not going to be the best version of yourself every day and every minute, right?
Mm.
Obviously, work is work, but if it's harder than it needs to be, if you're feeling like it's negative more often than it's positive, then it's a good opportunity to think maybe a little bit more expansively about what you're doing.
Totally. And I tell people all the time, like a lot of times, like that first step is usually the hardest, right? Of, one acknowledging that, okay, maybe I'm not super pleased with like how things are going and I want to make a change. I'm not really sure how to do that. And honestly, what I tell people is start to either whether it's posted on LinkedIn, post on Instagram, just like put it into the world, write it down, like put it into the world because when it's in the world, again, that starts the process. It starts the world kind of knowing I like to think of it, this is a terrible analogy probably, but I like to think of it kind of like an algorithm, like when you think about TikTok or Instagram or whatever, right? When you put something into the algorithm, it feeds you similar things back. And it's the same thing I like to think about when you're like journaling or you're like posting. When you put things into the world, it's going to give you that back. So if you start writing things down, maybe you have a friend that reaches out to you and says, hey, like, can I pick your brain about something? Like, I've been thinking about starting this thing, or whatever, right? So it's like, you'd be surprised how that kind of happens and how the universe starts to work around you to kind of help you on that mission.
Love that analogy. I might borrow it because I think
Yeah, of
there's so
course.
much talk these days about manifesting, right? And I think that makes it sound very mystical and magical, when in actuality, it's exactly what you're saying, is
Mhm.
when you know what you want and you sort of put your energy behind it and you're putting that out into the world, then you're getting that in return. And I love the idea of it being like an algorithm.
It's so true.
It's especially for analytical people to relate, because sometimes that woo-woo stuff feels a little bit out of reach, but
100%. I mean, it's like the idea of like getting like, an ad that you're like, I was just talking about that vacuum cleaner, right? It's the same thing, right? And it's honestly, it feels like how the universe works, right? Like it's gonna feed you. It's just and it can work in the wrong side too, right? Like if you're not the best version of yourself, you might attract people that are also not the best version of themselves. If you're, whatever, right? So it can work on the flip side. So I think it's a really powerful tool, and it's a really powerful like mindset to start to take on, but you have to like be careful because it can show a dark side.
exactly. Yeah, this has been such an amazing conversation, Evan. I'm so grateful to you for sharing your insights and your story with us. For people who are listening who want to learn more about you, especially about your new venture and maybe pickleball more broadly, where can people find you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this has been great. So you can find me at Evan Kuterbach on LinkedIn. I actually post a lot on LinkedIn about being a solopreneur, building things out. I also just launched a weekly newsletter called The Honest Hustle, which is just about kind of what it's like to build something as a solopreneur, doing things with intention. So I really break things down in that weekly newsletter. But then for Canyon Pickleball, you can find us at canyonpickleball.com on Instagram. I'm always also posting behind the scenes stuff there. So yeah, I'm really vulnerable about what it's like to build a business and how scary it is and how great it is. So yeah, I would love for anyone that wants to join in that journey. So
Well, thank you for being such an inspiration too. I think it's really great to have people who have with more honest voices about the harder side of entrepreneurship, and whether you're, in pickleball in particular, or just exploring entrepreneurship more broadly, this is something that we can all relate to. And so I really appreciate your being here, and also everything that you're doing out in the world to share your message.
yeah, no, Kim, thank you so much. And honestly, like as soon as I saw your podcast, I was super excited because again, like I want to demystify this whole idea of, again, no one really knows what they're doing, right? We're all just figuring it out. So yeah, thank you what you're doing too.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.